Right, good morning, everyone. To begin with, I want to draw your attention to Proverbs 31. This was a brief reference that Tony made in worship, but I want us to turn there together. Proverbs 31. And this is a tribute to mothers everywhere. Read with me starting in verse number 28. Her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favour is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. So this is not my tribute. This is actually God's tribute to women and to mothers everywhere. So happy Mother's Day, one and all. And on that note, guess what? I want you to all stand. I want you to welcome our visitors. I want you especially to reach out to a sister, to a mother, and to a woman in this church family and tell them how special they are. You have 1 minute, go. Right. Okay, guys, start making your way back to your seats. Final hugs. Oh, it's not Father's Day. There you go. Okay. So thank you to the ladies in this church, to the mothers in this assembly and everywhere. You are special. Let's now turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is going to be the main focus for today's lesson. And there's some giants awaiting us there. 1 Samuel chapter 17, our series on giant slayers continues. And let's pick up our reading in verse number 3. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now that's 9 feet, 9 inches tall. That's a giant. And speaking of giants, I couldn't help but think we need to spare Sister Sarah, we thought this morning, because she's not slaying one giant, but 2. First of all, she got up and she sang a wonderful solo in worship service. And that's tough. And she did a terrific job. So that's one giant down. And now she's got this other giant called Sunday School. And man, does she have a lot of kids to teach. So we'll check out and we'll see how her giant slaying went in our potluck lunch at the conclusion of the service. But Goliath was a giant adversary and a big problem for God's people to face. In fact, the whole victory that Israel needed to seek and to lay claim to it was being stopped and really hindered by the presence of this giant before them. God's people had to cross the valley of Elah, and they had to get to the other side in order to really triumph. And you know what? There was a giant right in the middle that was opposing them. That was the problem. And spiritually speaking, this is our problem too. How many times does God want to lead us through our valleys and really bless us on the other side? And we can't ever really seem to get there. And do you know why? It's because there's a giant standing in our way. A big problem, a big obstacle that somehow we need to come to terms with and face. This is the challenge that we are faced with today. It's a giant. I don't know what your giant is, but you have one. Last week we set about to name our giants, didn't we? And we effectively did that by looking at a number of common characteristics every giant seems to have. And these distinguishing factors, they help you to identify what that giant problem is in your life, the thing that is hindering God's best for you. And more to the point, I guess, we have this issue because unlike David's giant that was physical, who stood there with an imposing presence and casting this enormous physical shadow, our giants are different. They're not physical because you know what? They're spiritual. So that means sometimes we don't readily see them even though they're standing right in front of us. Are you following what I'm saying? Giants that need to be slayed, right? But you are never going to defeat your giant unless you're first able to name your giant. Do you know what your giant is? What is that thing that's standing in the way of you and your relationship with God? So what are these common characteristics that help us to readily identify and distinguish our giants? Well, the first thing is giants are big, right? You don't need me to tell you that. In fact, they just are. Everyone knows giants are big. Goliath was 9 feet, 9 inches tall. That's massive. That's a huge physical obstacle requiring putting down. And the thing about our problems, our obstacles, you know, these enormous hindrances in our life, it doesn't matter what it is, what shape and form it takes, what you call it, it's always going to be a big issue in your life if you don't put it down. Giants are big. What is that issue for you? I don't know. The other distinguishing factor is that giants are, they originate from somewhere, right? Every giant comes from somewhere in your life. Goliath came from Gath. That's what the scriptures declare. Where does your giant come from? Most of them are born out of our lives in some kind of way, shape and form. Where does that come from? Where does that problem originate from? That's what you've got to seek to ask and answer. Now, for some of us, our giants come from our past. They're past regrets, past failures, past hurts, past shame, whatever it is. These are where our giants are born from, okay? And there's a big problem with us really living and embracing the present if we're being held back with a giant problem in our past. That's an issue, right? But for some of us, it's not the past. It's actually the present that's the problem. It's our poor decisions. It's our choices. It's the decisions we are making from day to day that are leading us away from the Lord and creating this massive issue in our life. So, where does your giant come from? Another thing to consider. Giants are also not just big and they don't come from somewhere, they're formidable, aren't they? Goliath, he was incredibly well armed and equipped. We looked at all that last week. He had the best weapons and armor money could buy. And he walked down into that battlefield with every strategic advantage he could carry. He was ready for that fight. And David didn't have all those things at his disposal. You know, he was a simple shepherd's boy. And that made this giant, which he had to face and put down, incredibly formidable. So when we make the application back into our lives, guess what? That problem that's standing in front of you, that huge obstacle that you need to put down and overcome, it is always going to be an incredibly difficult fight for you. It's going to be well-equipped, well-situated, well-grounded to do exactly what it's doing, and that's hindering you in your relationship with God. So we've got to recognize that giants are formidable. And this brings us to really the last thing. Goliath, he went out in that battlefield 40 days in a row, didn't he? Both morning and night, and he taunted Israel. He defied anyone to come and fight him. And this is the thing about your giant. It is nothing if not relentless in its presence and impact in your life. It's always there, and it's never going to go away unless you put it down. It's relentless. So, what do we do about these things? I wonder, can you name your giant? Are you seeing it now? Because these are all the distinguishing factors that help us to readily identify it. They are big, they have a place of origin, it comes from somewhere in your life, they are always formidable, and they're relentless in their attack against you. So what is your giant? Can you name it? Really important, right? Because if you can't name your giant, you're never going to defeat your giant. But the best thing about understanding all this and being able to name your giant is, guess what? It's understanding that you can defeat it. Because giants can be put down. This whole series of lessons is called Giant Slayers, right? That's what God is calling us to do. He's calling us to cross our valleys, those low points in our lives, and to actively engage and put down those issues, whatever they might be. Giants can be put down. But the first step is you have to name it. You have to name it to defeat it. Of course, that's not all there is to it, let's be honest. You know, this is not just some theoretical exercise where we sit around all day talking about our problems. I wish it was that simple. But unfortunately, it's not that easy. Sure, naming our giant is where it all starts, but naming it is really nothing at the end of the day if you're not willing to face it. It's kind of nice to just sit back from the battle's edge and look at everything going on, and from your own comfort zone, you know, pick out your giants. Well, there he is over there. You know, see that big issue, that big problem? That's what's standing in my way. That's great. Well, that doesn't change the fact that you're in this predicament. There's a giant in your life that you have to put down. Talking about it's not going to be enough. You know what you need to do? You need to actively face it. That's a whole nother step. And that requires a whole nother challenge in order for us to overcome, to claim victory in our lives. The battle has to be fought before it can ever be won. You have to face your giant. So let's talk about that. I'm just going to give it to you straight to the point. The biggest issue you're going to have when it comes to facing your giant is fear. That's it. That's the issue, right? That's going to stop you, after you've named your giant, from actually walking down into that valley to face it. It's your fear. Goliath stood as an incredibly opposing, intimidating, highly capable adversary who cast this enormous shadow, and nobody wanted to face him. Everyone was too afraid. I want you to take careful note of this with me now, starting in verse number 8. Let's read it. It says, "And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall you be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And get this, because this is important, verse 11. "And when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." See that? Fear. There it is. The word dismayed used here means to be broken, it means to be afraid, it means to be frightened, terrified, and discouraged. And interestingly, it comes from a root word meaning to be in panic, a state of panic. Now, the whole idea here which is being taught and readily put in front of us over and over again, is fear. It's a very real emotion. It's a very powerful thing that exists in our lives. The people of Israel were exceedingly afraid. They were panicked even when it came to facing this giant. So then here's the question, right? This is the first question you need to come to terms with today. What are you afraid of? I'm not talking about heights and spiders and, all these little things. I'm talking about what are you really afraid of when it comes to facing up to that key problem in your life. Why are you not slaying your giant? What is it that you would rather run away from than face in your life? What is that thing that strikes fear into your very heart just thinking about? Because it's highly likely that that thing that has all your fears are linked to, that's going to be your giant. It's no secret that Goliath wanted to fight. That's exactly why he came. And the thing that Goliath was proposing, right, a fight between two champions, a fight between two of the elite to determine the outcome of the whole battle, well, that seems like a sound proposition. After all, it was clearly the humane thing to do to avoid seemingly loss of life. Why do thousands need to die when only two need to die, right? The only problem was, and this is what Goliath was proposing, let's just two of us fight and we'll sort this out. The only problem was the physical odds were all steeped in Goliath's favor, weren't they? That's why everyone ran away from him. This was going to be a big fight. This was going to be a hard fight. This was going to be an impossible fight. And I'll tell you what, this was an incredibly scary fight too. No one wanted to get into it. This was not a man anyone wanted to face, because he clearly struck fear into the hearts of anyone who dared to oppose him. And Goliath actively defied the armies of Israel and sought someone to engage in a fight with him. Now, single combat of this type, it's also called champion warfare sometimes, is probably more common in romantic poetry and various myths of the ancient world than it is based in fact. But there are a few recorded examples of this actually taking place throughout history. Can you believe that? The samurai, for example, had a fighting tradition that was based on single combat known as igushi. The Russians referred to it as bash-na-bash, meaning one-on-one. Single combat is also frequently referenced throughout history of ancient Rome. And even in the Bible, there are other references to conflict of this sort. Conflict between champions to determine the outcome of the fight. There's an example that comes to mind, a very vivid account given in 2 Samuel, where a vicious clash occurred between the house of David and the house of Saul, and men were selected from both sides who met at the pool of Gibeon and fought to the death. In this account, 12 champions were chosen from each side for the duel, and so bloody was the confrontation that followed that everyone fell and perished to the man. You will find that account in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. So again, what Goliath is proposing here is not entirely unreasonable. Send out your best and let's fight, he said. The only problem was no one could muster the courage to face him. And again, I want you to take note of, in passing, of verse number 16. Look at this. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. That's the challenge, it's clear. There is no mistaking it. For 40 days in a row, both morning and evening, Goliath came out and presented himself as a giant. And he said, fight me if you dare. Why did no one answer the call? Why didn't anyone step up and take up that challenge? It's because they were all too afraid. This predicament Just went on and on, didn't it? One day after the next, after the next, after the next, that giant just stood there and defied everyone and everything because no one had the courage to face him. You think about that when it comes to your life. Round and round we go. How often do we fall into this trap? Where we just let our giant stand there and defy us, opposing us, standing as a blatant obstacle in the way of God's blessings in our life because we don't have the courage to readily face it. The number one hurdle that will always hinder you from facing what you need to face most is fear. Fear will stop you from fighting every time. So what are you afraid of? Can you hear that? Because I swear I can hear a giant call. I can hear him taunting. I can hear his disdain for you and for God. And tell me, just how long has that giant been opposing you? How many days has it been? Face me if you dare. That's his battle cry. So what's it going to take for you to face your Goliath? We all have giants that we need to face. We all have those things standing in the way of our relationship with God, blocking his best in our lives. So what's it going to take for us to face that? Well, I can tell you before you ever face your giant, you have to conquer your fear. So then here's the next question. How do we do that? How do we overcome our fears? How do we muster the courage to leave the perceived safety of our comfort zones and willingly head down into that valley to face our very own Goliath? Put another way, how do we fight when we're afraid? That's tough. That's always going to be a difficult fight to win. Well, thankfully, David provides us with the answer to this. In fact, by studying David's story in this account, we can learn two things. Firstly, David faced his giant because he knew he was destined for greater things. He knew that the Lord, and with the Lord in his life, there was going to be a greater future that existed for him beyond the giant. This is important for us to recognize because there is no point in venturing down into the valley to face certain opposition if you don't believe anything great will become of it. The second thing we learn from looking at David's life is that facing your giant requires knowing and understanding the cause. If you don't have a cause to fight, you will never enter into the fight. And if you have no cause to face your giant, you never will. So let me show you what I mean, right? Let's see this together in the scripture. First things first, do you believe that with God you are destined for greater things? Do you believe that God has a great future in mind just for you? You know, so far all we've really done is focus on our giants. But this is the part of the story where David enters in. The Philistines had their champion and his name was Goliath, but as it turns out, Israel had their champion too. His name was David. And please remember, David in this spiritual account, well, he represents us. And just like David, God is now calling us to become the hero of our own story. But we have to slay some giants. When we read David's story, I want you to understand this is your story too. Do you believe that? Because God has great things in mind for those that do. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, well, I'm no hero, and I'm certainly no giant slayer. Well, you know what? Neither was David until the day that he was. In fact, the more you study David's life, the more you come to realize that he was not the kind of hero you would come to expect from a biblical story like this. David came from an unassuming background, and he was far from perfect. But still, that didn't stop God from doing great things in his life. The presence of Goliath in this war, we can all understand. Giants, Big problems, big obstacles. We get that. But the presence of David requires a little more study in order for us to really appreciate. I want you to notice some details about our reluctant hero. Look at verse 12. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And I just want to stop here for a moment. We've already talked about the origin of Goliath, right? But take note, because this is the origin of David. Every great story has a hero. Notice where he comes from. He was an Ephrathite, and that simply means an inhabitant or a descendant of Ephraim, who was of Bethlehem, Judah. Or rather, he dwelled in or near the city of Bethlehem, which was part of the inherited portion of Judah, right? And you sit there and you go, well, okay, but so what? What's the significance of all that? Well, the scriptures declare to us that the Messiah was going to come from the tribe of Judah and be born out of Bethlehem. Yes? 1 Samuel 17. Yeah. In fact, Micah 5 verse number 2 says this about the promise of the Messiah and his birth in Bethlehem. But thou, Bethlehem, though thou be little among thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me that which is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. Furthermore, it was prophesied that Christ would come directly from royal lineage, being a branch out of the root of Jesse. And I know that doesn't mean a lot to us, but there is historical significance to this. In fact, Jesus was said to come directly from the line and the descendants of the house of David. And you can find references to that in Isaiah 11 verse 1, Romans 15:12, Luke 1, 32 and 33. Those are just to name a few. But the words of Jeremiah chapter 23 verses 5 and 6, they're really the ones that stand out to me most. Because it says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, a king that shall reign and prosper and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. In the days of Judah, in his days that Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name. Who's this going to be? This is his name whereby he shall be called the Lord, our righteousness. Now these are all prophetic verses, okay? And they speak and foretell the coming of Christ. And we're told where it all started, right here. It started in a place called Bethlehem with a man named Jesse and his son David, the hero of our story. So this is pretty special, right? David clearly was destined for greater things. God had a plan for him. Greater things were to come. I want you to hold on to that thought, but we're going to come back to it in a moment. But first, let's continue reading in verse 12. Now David, the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, he had 8 sons. And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. Now, it's easy to skip over verses like these, isn't it? We just read it and we just carry on. We just pick and choose the tidbits we want to hold on to. But this is actually really important to our story. This provides important clarity and detail concerning the context. First of all, it is noteworthy that David comes from a big family and he was young. In fact, we are told that his father was considered an old man for his day and that David himself was the youngest of 8 brothers. See that? The word youngest that is used here is interesting. It's the Hebrew word kotam. And as expected, it does have reference to age. However, the word is used in a far broader application because it also speaks of that which is small, little, the least, and it infers that which is insignificant or unimportant. Now, unfortunately, this seems to be rather in keeping with how members of David's own family, the future hero of our story, This is in keeping with how his own family and even his father viewed him at the time. He was the youngest and considered to be somewhat insignificant in the day-to-day family affairs of that household. 8 brothers, and he was the youngest. I want you to see this with me a little bit in a little bit more detail. Flick back now to chapter number 16. Just flip over one chapter. Because according to Jewish tradition and custom, a double portion of the family's inheritance was to go to the eldest son, and the rest was then to be divided and shared amongst those who remained. But David was the youngest and the last in line. Therefore, in terms of carrying on the family name and making this great presence within the world, well, he was kind of unimportant. He was not considered to carry on the family name and do great things. The responsibility for that was to fall upon his older siblings, especially the eldest, Eliab. And this casual attitude towards David is emphasized here in chapter 16, because one day the prophet Samuel comes to Bethlehem and meets Jesse's family. Now, the context of chapter 16, just to help you fill in the gaps. God sent Samuel to Bethlehem on a secret mission of sorts, and he was sent to anoint the future king of Israel. And as previously mentioned, God declared the very heir to the kingship would come from the house of Jesse, right? That had all been prophesied of. And I sort of touched on this a little bit, but Jesse was not a nobody, okay? He was the son of Obed and the grandson of Boaz and Ruth. And there's a very wonderful book in the Bible called Ruth. And I tell you what, if you want to learn more about Jesse and David's family tree and their history, you should read that book. But Boaz was a very wealthy man in Bethlehem, and that wealth was passed on to Obed, his eldest son. And guess what? That was then passed by Obed unto Jesse, his eldest son. That is David's father. But there's a problem here because David's the youngest. He's the least important in his family. He's the last to receive any kind of wealth or inheritance. Interestingly, though, all of this is important. In fact, it's directly referenced, this lineage that comes directly through Jesse and the house of David. Even in Matthew 1, verses 5 and 6, Jesus is stated to come directly from this lineage. Of course, this is all the starting point for this. You know, here in chapter 16, and the place where we see all of this important history coming together. The Lord sent Samuel to Bethlehem to make a sacrifice. But the sacrifice was merely a guise to bring Jesse and all his sons together for this reason. David was to become king. Great things were laid down for this young man. However, after inspection of the first 7 brothers, the prophet Samuel looks around and it's clear that God has not chosen any of these before him. So he says, and I want you to see what happens next, are there any more sons? Look at verse 11. And Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? And he said, there remaineth yet the youngest, that's the Hebrew word kortan, the least, the unimportant, the insignificant, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. He's busy right now, we've got to put him to work. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. 2 things noteworthy about that. Firstly, David was not even brought to the sacrifice or placed before the prophet Samuel. Did you notice that? He was just kind of overlooked and dismissed as being unimportant for this occasion. And trust me, when you have a prophet of God visit your personal residence, even back in biblical times, that was a big deal, okay? In fact, initially, Jesse and all the city elders were afraid at Samuel's sudden coming, because this was rather unorthodox, and it was almost considered as an ill omen. Look at verse 4. And Samuel did that which the Lord spake, and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled at his coming, and said, comest thou peaceably? Well, what are you doing here, Samuel? Well, what's wrong? What's going on? Well, nothing. God sent him there for an important reason. There was a hero in this place, and And he had to be found because he was the future king of Israel. Great things God had planned for his life. And you would think that when the prophet God shows up and asks Jesse to bring everyone from his household together for this purpose, that Jesse would have quickly brought his 8 sons. But he didn't. David was not even summoned. He was just left out there in the fields. His presence was not considered important for this occasion. And that brings me to the second thing that's really noteworthy about verse 11. God saw something great within David. No one else saw it, but God did. Everyone else looked past David. They overlooked David. But the Lord didn't, because he had great things in mind for him. What great things does God have in mind for you? The rest of this world might not even give you a second thought. No one might spare a time or a consideration in their day for you. But God does. Because he has something great in mind for us all. Look at verse 12. And Jesse sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. This is going to be the future king. The lowly shepherd boy that everyone forgot about. He's the great one that needs to be reckoned for this occasion. God sent his prophet to anoint David, not anyone else, not the firstborn, not the most important, not the greatest, but the least in the house of Jesse. You know, the anointing of a person's head with oil, that was a very symbolic, very important thing in biblical times. It really signified and represented God's favor and the passing on of authority. So this was often done at the crowning of new kings. There was an anointing of their head with oil, very symbolic. Look at verse 13. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, David, in the midst of all his brethren. He was the one that was honored. And the Spirit of the Lord, note that, came upon David from that day forward. This was the beginning of great things. And the power and authority of God from that point forward rested upon David. And he was destined for something else, not just tending sheep. There was no way David could have known that. He didn't know that one day he would be king. He didn't know anything about the Messiah's coming or the prophecies that were made. He didn't even know anything about Goliath or the giant that he was going to have to face. But I can tell you this, David knew that God was great and that with his presence in his life, he was destined for greater things. He may have been the youngest, the least significant within his family, but he held on to the prospect of a greater future with the Lord. All of his brothers and even his father may have failed to recognize his true value at that point, or his future importance to Israel. But David knew in his heart that God had great plans for him. And I can't help but wonder, do you feel like you're destined for something great in your life? Do you feel like God has led you to this point because he intends something greater for you? He has something greater that he wants to share, greater blessings that await. If you don't believe that, then you'll never face your giant. What's the point of facing those giant obstacles that exist in your life if you don't believe anything great is going to come of it? You'll just be like everyone else in Israel and stand there day after day after day and in your own fear fail to conquer what is most prevalent in your life. We have to face our giant, remember? But to do so, we've got to overcome our fear. How did David do it? The simple, seemingly unimportant, shepherd's boy out of Bethlehem. How did he march down into that valley and slay a giant? Well, he overcame his fear. And the first thing that led him to that point in his life was recognition of God's great presence with him and the leading in his life towards greater things. How easy would it have been for David to ignore the giant's taunts, just like everyone else. How easy would it have been for him to just ignore the challenge that was right in front of him? He could have done that. And you know what? From that point on, he never would have truly embraced the great things that God had in store for him. He could forfeit greatness because he was too afraid to face what was right in front of him. Don't think that somehow your life is insignificant. I don't want anyone here today thinking that where they're at, their personal struggles, their own hurts, their heartaches are not important. Because God sees you as incredibly important and he wants to share greatness with you. I want you to turn with me now to Deuteronomy chapter 20. These are the Lord's words to Israel before their conquest into the Canaan land. Deuteronomy 20. God declared these words because he knew his people were going to face great opposition. Look at verse 3. You shall say unto them, Hear, O Israel, you approach this day unto battle against your enemies. Let not your hearts faint, fear not, and do not tremble, neither be terrified because of them. Don't fear your giants. See that? For the Lord your God is he that goeth with you, to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. You see, just like with David, God had a greater plan and purpose for Israel. But they had to first face some giant opposition in their lives, didn't they? They had a fight sitting in front of them, and they had to engage in that fight. They had to face those giants. But God said, don't fear, don't be afraid, do not tremble. Why? Because I have greater things in mind for you. Do you believe that we serve a great God? Do you believe he wants to share some great things with you? Do you recognize there's some obstacles and some challenges you're going to have to face along the way to God's best? Then you need to face those things in your life. Don't fall into the trap of the common people of Israel, because everyone was just too afraid to do what was necessary. If there's one thing that God wants you to know today, it's that with him, there is no obstacle that will be too great. With him, there is no giant that cannot be put down. And that with him, you can experience true greatness in your life. So we've talked about naming our giants. We've talked about facing our giants. And next week, we're going to talk about the cause we have in engaging in our fight. Thank you for your attention. Worship team.
Everyone like to stand, please. Thanks for that. Another great message, supposed to be. Facing our giants.